The National Park Service and the U.S. Navy have searched for the wreck of a Japanese midget submarine. An hour before the Japanese savaged Pearl Harbor, a U.S. destroyer sank the tiny vessel. The encounter could have warned American forces that bombs and torpedoes were about to rain on Battleship Row, but it did not.
Now hold that, shift her around.
Marine archaeologist Dan Lenehan directed the hunt for the midget sub. Jim Delgado was the project's historian. Their collaboration grew out of earlier research below the surface of Pearl Harbor. They searched for evidence of a bygone conflict, a battle waged underwater by 5 midget submarines. One sub played a special role.
And what's particularly exciting about the midget sub that's outside the entrance is it would have represented the first exchange of hostilities between the United States and Japan in World War II. And because remember that this sub was sunk an hour before the planes attacked Pearl Harbor. An incredibly important, significant find if we could do it.
The search for the midget sub focused on a square mile of debris-laden bottom. The area is a graveyard of war relics, like this old Navy plane. 1,000 feet down in the darkness, everything begins to resemble a sub. But what they're looking for is 80 feet long and 6 feet across. It carried 2 torpedoes and was manned by an officer and a navigator.
They were going to come on in, sit and wait, and then when the attack occurred, when the planes came in, when all hell broke loose in Pearl Harbor, they would surface, fire their torpedoes, wreak as much havoc as they could, swing around Ford Island, head back on out, and then rendezvous with their mother subs to be taken back to Japan.
The mother ships moved into position off Diamond Head before midnight, December 6, 1941. They arrived ahead of the Imperial Navy Task Force. Each mothership had a midget sub strapped to its hull. The larger craft would release the midgets before dawn and retrieve them after the attack. But the tiny vessels would never return from the battle, a clash of giants that had been brewing for years.
A long series of brutal attacks upon
From Manchuria to French Indochina, in less than a decade, Japan had rolled up a long list of conquests across Asia. Despite an Allied embargo on war materials, she was growing stronger. By late 1941, the vast resources of Southeast Asia lay before the rising sun. Their only protection, a scattering of British and Dutch outposts, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet.
I think there was a general sense that the war would break out. I don't think anybody expected that it would take place here at Pearl Harbor.
Successfully surprising an island fortress 4,000 miles away also seemed impossible to Japanese leaders. But Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto convinced them this daring raid was the only way to disarm the sleeping giant. Japan had to smash America's Pacific Fleet, even if that meant attacking its home base in Oahu's natural harbor. Japanese pilots trained hard through the fall of 1941. So did the crews handpicked to pilot the midget subs, the fastest boats of their kind. Soon, they would have their chance for glory.
Secretary of State.
In Washington, Japanese diplomats continued to seek peace through negotiation until the final hour.
No American will ever forget this.
Not even Japan's ambassador knew of the coming attack.
Mass murder in their hearts.
December 7th, 1941. As Oahu slept, the Japanese task force brought 350 attack planes into striking distance of Pearl Harbor, just 200 miles away. In Washington, military intelligence teams had broken Japan's diplomatic code. They knew an armada was somewhere in the Pacific, but they did not know its destination. Near Diamond Head, dawn was approaching. The Japanese mother subs surfaced to release the midget submarines. But something went wrong. At 6:30 a.m., a seaplane pilot and a freighter crew reported a strange sub approaching Pearl Harbor. The captain of a nearby destroyer, the USS Ward, realized intruders were trying to penetrate the fleet's defenses. His gunners opened fire. The midget sub began sinking in 1,000 feet of water. Depth charges finished her off. The Ward reported the sinking twice. But before notifying Pacific Fleet Commander Husband E. Kimmel, District Headquarters waited 30 minutes. The delay was all the attackers needed. News of the sub might have prevented what happened next.
Well, the message was radioed in that they'd fired on and depth charged this sub. It didn't reach Admiral Kimmel. It wasn't until just a few minutes before the attack commenced in earnest with the planes coming in that the Admiral was finally phoned and told, look, we got this message in from the commander of the Ward saying that he's fired upon a sub operating in an offensive zone. Kimmel says, well, why wasn't I told about this? He's putting his uniform on, he's heading out, and at that moment, the planes come screaming in overhead, the bombs start dropping.
At 5 minutes to 8, 40 torpedo planes roared over Ford Island, bearing the mark of the rising sun. Accompanying them were 51 dive bombers, 49 high-level bombers, and 43 fighters. American sailors thought they were seeing a practice drill. Bombs and bullets found them eating breakfast, ironing uniforms, or staring into the fatal sky. Arizona, Oklahoma, California. One by one, the great ships sank. The West Virginia alone took 6 torpedoes and countless bombs. Pearl Harbor's air defense burned on the runways. Only a handful of pilots managed to scramble into a sky thick with enemy planes. The midget sub's moment had come, but one had been sunk by the Ward. A second was depth charged outside the harbor. Of the 3 that remained, 2 posed a threat to Battleship Row. Between waves of attacking planes, Sub 3 fired a torpedo and missed. Moments later, it was rammed and depth charged by a destroyer making for the open sea. Sub and crew hit bottom. Overhead, the Japanese continued their assault. But now smoke and anti-aircraft fire obscured their targets. The sleeping giant had awakened. Ripped by a bomb that set off an ammunition magazine, Battleship Arizona blazed toward her doom. Survivors staggered into waters aflame with burning oil. Japan's brilliant, relentless attack had killed more than 2,400 Americans and crippled most of the U.S. battleships in the Pacific. For the midget subs, though, the battle was not as glorious. 2 still roamed Hawaiian waters. Number 4, which may have fired at Battleship Row, radioed news of Japan's victory to the fleet that evening. Then she disappeared, never to be heard from again. The subs may not have seen resounding success, but Japan needed heroes. So the propaganda machine reincarnated their crews as the 9 young gods of Pearl Harbor. This wartime Japanese feature told their story with luxurious exaggeration. In truth, quarters were cramped and reeked of battery fumes. The midget subs helped create confusion at Pearl Harbor, but didn't affect the war's outcome. And what of the last midget sub at Pearl Harbor? Commanded by Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, it suffered a fate worse than sinking. On December 8th, as President Franklin D. Roosevelt called for war, Sakamaki's sub washed up on the far shore of Oahu, undone by a faulty gyroscope.
his submarine wouldn't function right, so he drifted all the way around the island to the opposite end and then around, and went ashore on the morning of December 8th at Bellows, where he and the crewmen assigned to the sub tried to blow the ship up. It didn't work. They jumped into the water. The crewman drowned, but Sakamaki washed ashore and became the first prisoner of war that the United States captured in the war in the Pacific. POW number 1.
Sakamaki spent the war in prison. His sub toured the U.S., helping